Thank you.
Yep. And why this is important to focus on is there are very few communities that have a building permit system, a process for plan review, and what we're having and what we're seeing through our inspectors and conversations at homes are not being built to the fullest capacity of the building codes or related standards. So that's why I want to focus on this authority having jurisdiction, because this is one of the major areas that's been, I won't use the word neglected, but it's been a challenge for many of the First Nation communities from a governance perspective to move forward when it comes to building capacity, sustainability of homes, etc. So, okay, next one, please. So, um, one of the other challenge that we have, and we get many calls from contractors saying, I want to build, I've been approached to build homes in some communities. And the first question they ask me, who applies for the building permit? Does the council apply for it or does the contractor? And I say there's no building permit system. And you can see in their voices for many of the contractors, they say, whoa, I'm not sure that if I want to get involved in this process, because all of a sudden, from their perspective, they're saying, oh, geez, there's no building permit system, liability, I'm taking on all this concerns. I'm not interested. I'm really busy working off reserve. I don't need to do that. In contrary, contractors go into First Nations and they know there's no building permit system. There's no plan review. And somehow, as Keith Miracle and many inspectors say, contractors somewhat go brain dead who have very good reputation off reserve, and then soon when they go on reserve, there's no obligations to continue. So they're cutting corners constantly. So again, you get what you have because there's no process otherwise to address those issues. Okay, next please. So we developed a process through FNNBOA and the board on how to address some of this authority having jurisdiction. And we developed what's called the Indigenous Building Knowledge Exchange. And while we understand that a lot of the First Nations don't have the authority having jurisdictions or the capacity, we developed this program or this initiative to basically help or assist communities to move forward. So, for example, many individuals don't have the capacity to hire contractors or to write proper terms of reference. Or if you have a change order, how do you address that, or is it really an appropriate change order? So we also we get a lot of issues of how do you hire contractors? How do you pre-qualify contractors? So through the next please, through the Indigenous Building Knowledge Exchange, we're putting out to many of the communities. We start as a pilot, and I'll believe we're going to reach out to first come, first served to any of the communities, with some exceptions, to offer these services. Go ahead, Claude. And why did we do this? Well, we know that through the years of working with various communities, we basically came to the determination that people who build responsible for construction, they're generally the housing managers. Housing managers do a terrific job in terms of managing housing. They do a terrific job in terms of policies and programs and rent and lease arrangements and dealing with the actual housing objective. When we come to managing construction projects, generally this falls on the lap of housing managers or people who, don't really have that capacity. And what this matrix basically tells us is that 70% of the communities don't have the management of construction projects, nor do they have the knowledge or capacity for construction practices. So what that tells us is that from the get-go, right from the very beginning, the construction process is destined for many problems and cost overruns because the person that has the responsibility to move it forward does not have that capacity. And what we found is that many First Nations, they're like stuck on an island and they're sort of like trying to work on this by themselves without any outreach. So to address that, this is where we also develop the Indigenous Building Knowledge Exchange. So again, here are some of our objectives, right? To help provide capacity to communities who want guidance or assistance to ensure construction projects are functioning, provide experts in construction knowledge, capacity, and also to address risk assessments. One of the problems is a lot of construction projects have risk, and we gave previous webinars about risk associated construction. So we would actually help to identify those risks. We also want to share information, the abilities, and ideas from other Indigenous communities. So for example, we know in some of the communities that sandy soil is really a challenge. Well, if that's the case, then we should have soil testing, we should have different foundations going in those communities. So we can share that knowledge with other communities. We can encourage construction innovation. So there's a big talk these days, right, about energy efficiencies, better homes, better windows. Well, we would hopefully have that knowledge that we can share. Identify and collect knowledge in construction projects that are particularly within Indigenous communities. Again, what are the best practices? Do we have a best practice inventory? I was on a call yesterday and somebody asked, would FNNBOA consider developing a series of architectural plans? They could be maybe 8 or 10 plans that are already pre-approved, done by architects, and make those available to communities who want to build, especially Section 95 houses, right? People who have their own money building communities, they're going to get their own architect. But can we come up with 3 or 4 designs for Section 95 houses that community can say, this is perfect, these meet all the requirements, this meets our budget, let's move forward. So that's one of the issues that we'll be looking at. We can also offer technical building education, workshops, and presentations. So we will continue with the webinars, but also now that COVID seems to open up everything, we want to have some hands-on practical courses, such as how to install proper windows, how do ICF forms basically work. Next, please. So what are the projects under Indigenous Building Knowledge Exchange? Well, procurement guidance. Basically, we can help a community to write the procurement document. So you give us a draft and we can look at it and say, okay, this looks great. Consider adding this, this, and this. Did you do a pre-qualifier or bid? So for example, if you're planning to build in September of 2023, well, we would suggest, why don't you do pre-qualifiers back in April? So then people know back in April that you're going to have money for September construction projects, so you can pre-qualify contractors in advance. That way you already have a pool of contractors who are interested in doing the job. Contract administration phrase, we can make sure and work with communities to make sure we're using CCDC contracts. We've had previous webinars on this, and again, we're stressing the importance of using CCDC contracts because those are the standard contracts that construction contractors use, and it sets out all the proper terms. And what I like about it is you don't use the contract from a contractor that says basically you only have 48 hours to sue us, or you can't sue us for our failure to meet code requirements. Next, please. Technical guidance. So here we can look at the plan. So if you have a blueprint, we would look at the plans to see if there's any errors, omissions. Are there conflicts with the building code? Is this really the best plan for the situation? What what we find is a challenge, and we know is somebody community gets money to build, and they're saying, oh, we got to move quickly. So you go to an old file and say, well, here's a plan, and we pull out this plan and let's go with it. Well, that plan could be probably is outdated. It's not meeting the most recent energy code. It may not be meeting more of the recent requirements, and even that plan might have been incorrect in the first place. So we would put out to say we can look at technical plans and blueprints, and hopefully have blueprints that are signed off by architects and engineers so that we know we're moving forward with at least a good framework. Also, risk assessments are a big one in construction projects. So the big one also building code and inspections. We know there is a lack of inspectors. We would actually be encouraging to use tele-inspections for these inspections. So if you need some inspection being done, we would use tele-inspection. So somebody from the community will take video or walk around with pictures, and we have an inspector looking at the other end, and we can do inspections that way. It's economical, and you get to meet some of your hurdles. It doesn't work. One thing we learned about COVID, we developed a tele-inspection manual a few years ago, and it was probably one of the hottest items going off our website. And not by First Nations, I can assure you. It was municipalities from in Canada and in the United States seeking permission to use it for their purposes. And they went forward and developed similar to a tele-inspections. Next, please. Barrier-free specifications. We've done a project on accessibility. We believe that's an important role for FNNBOA to carry out. And we want to make sure designs to ramps are being done properly and that doors can be adjusted. So we would work with the councils to help with those designs and specifications. While there are standards, we know in many First Nations communities, because of dealing with permafrost and climate, that some of these ramps don't work in those areas. We actually been talking about designing homes where ramps are built actually under carports, and carport will become the main front door. So at least there's some coverage over a ramp. So we've been working with some architects for those designs. Next, please. Renovation guidance. One of the biggest problems that we know is, while we always talk about new construction, there is not a lot given to renovations. And so we would work with those communities who plan to do renovations. Again, we would look at the plans, we will help with those procurements. We would make sure they have proper insurance, proper contracts, and again, we're holding the hands of communities. We're not taking over. We don't want to become the authority having jurisdiction. We're just saying we can provide with this advice for renovation guidance. Next, please. The biggie is HOT 2000 energy program. Very few communities use this. HOT 2000 energy is where we receive a blueprint. We have a company that will look at the blueprint and they will model it and say, okay, this is the type of installation you need for your roof, for your ceilings, and this is what we suggest you do. And then when you go out for tender, this is what you will require for installation. And again, we would pay for that service for communities. And if we don't, it's not that expensive. I believe it's only like $400. And if you do one home in the community, you can use it for a very similar type of structure. So it's not inexpensive for a proposition, but it's very critical, especially when everybody's trying to meet energy efficiency levels. So it's really important to take advantage of. Next, please. We're also working on a more recent project, and that's on radon gas mitigation strategies. Basically, if you look at a radon gas map, of Canada, and we've had already a webinar on it. Most of the First Nations in Canada are situated on bedrock that releases radon gas. And radon gas is odorless, is colorless. It's basically uranium gases and other particles come up through the ground and seep it into your homes. And it comes through cracks of foundations, through venting pipes. If you have crawl spaces, it just seeps right through. It's very important because of the health implications. It's one of the second biggest risk exposures for lung cancer for people who don't smoke, and it substantially increases lung cancer to people who smoke. So we reached out as a pilot and on radiation, and we're probably opening that to all communities. Again, Indigenous Building Knowledge Exchange and Radon Gas, they're all free. We receive funds to work with communities. We start out as a pilot, and we'll be sending out notes probably in the next week to put it out to everybody on a first come, first served basis. So we're going to quickly expand that. Okay, next please. So why Indigenous Building Knowledge and Authority having jurisdiction? Basically, the challenge has been we want to work with communities to make sure they're exercising their authority having jurisdiction properly. We want to make sure that the knowledge, the skills, the capacity, the expertise is being supported and ported into those communities to make sure that at the end of the day, a home is built in accordance to building codes and standards. And it's almost like a turnkey solution. We don't care who goes in the house after. We don't care, how the housing allocation occurs. That's totally up to the housing managers. Our job is make sure when that occupation permit, which we would argue has been submitted, people receive the keys, we're happy, we're comfortable, that house has been built to code, and it should last more than 6-7 years. This generally is the concerns that we have. So that's why we've been pushing this authority having jurisdiction and Indigenous Building Knowledge Exchange. And we know a lot of the capacity is we want to hire our own contractors in the community, which I think is terrific. And it's important, though, that we get these contractors trained and work with them through mentorship so that they can build in accordance to building codes and fire building codes and other standards. Next, please. So any questions up to that before I move on to the ban bylaws, bylaw structures? Anything there on Claude or just
I don't see anything, John. I think we could probably proceed if you like.
Next, please. So one of the big issues we talk about is authority having jurisdiction. We talk about how the Indian Act and the First Nation Land Management Act and those who have entered into modern treaties are provided with a governing powers to control their activities in the communities. And this is done through bylaw making powers. So where band council resolutions have their process, bylaw making power is more entrenched and more credible in terms of holding more credence, credibility of the community plans to do move in certain directions. I want to go now through how the bylaw making power occurs, how it conflicts with some federal laws, and we're related directly to ban bylaws relating to building permits. So bylaw passing at the community. So we know bylaws for drafting bylaws for community council. There's several basic steps. They have to convene a community meeting. They have to introduce the bylaw by a motion. So if they're going to introduce the bylaw for barking dogs, for fencing, for controlling certain behaviors, for trespassing, for building permits, for example, they have to read the bylaw. It has to be voted by council. It has to be a recorded meeting, so you have a record of the minutes. The bylaw then has to be signed. It has to be produced, printed, and it has to be forwarded to the minister for confirmation. No longer do you need a ministerial signature on band bylaws. Years ago, the minister had to approve everything. That's no longer the case. You just have to inform the minister still responsible. You just have to inform him of their activities. Next, please. There was changes to the Indian Act where, as I mentioned, the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada is no longer has oversight and disallowance powers. So First Nations no longer required to forward copies to the Minister of Bylaws made under Section 81, and those are which are most of the building permits. Next, please. So publication of band bylaws, extremely important. The Act requires that the council publishes bylaws on the internet. The first, there's a publication called the First Nations Gazette, or it's a newspaper that has general circulations in the community. So if you type in First Nations Gazette, you can actually get a listing of all the bylaws or what's happening in terms of all the communities from coast to coast to coast. It's actually a very good resource to see what's happening in communities. The bylaws only come into force, sorry, back me up there a sec, please. Bylaws only come into force once it's published on or on the later date. So for example, they can say, you know, starting January 1st, 2023 will come in force. If you, again, I mentioned if you go to the First Nations Gazette and there's the listing fng.ca. So, okay. So one of the big challenges of any bylaws is enforcement. And there's always the big debate, you know, rules are made by people to be broken by people and to be enforced by people. And that's really the general on any rules. It doesn't matter if you're making rules for a community or, you know, for a local church, you know, rules are made by humans to be broken by humans and to be forced by humans. So it's a bit of a convoluted. But when it comes to building bylaws in First Nations, one of the big things that does not exist in many communities is you cannot do a stop work order. So if an inspector goes to a home, he notices that the home's not being built to code. He doesn't have the powers to issue stop work order because there's no band bylaws to say, you know, the chief building officer in the community who you have to identify, and it could be even an inspector by name, but who has that title. Very few communities can issue a stop work order. I believe outside of maybe 6 that I know of can actually have that power. And then what happens is if you don't have a stop work order power, then you know you can try a summary conviction for bylaw infractions, and there's sort of the rules that set it out. But at the end of the day, what happens in building enforcement, and again, it doesn't matter on or off reserve, it becomes a question of moral suasion, education, working with the contractors, as close as you can to make sure that those homes are being built properly. So with that happening, you know, well, bylaws are important. Summary convictions are, you know, important because again, there's a whole discussion of who does the summary convictions. Is it the Crown, provincial, is it the federal? We won't get into that discussion because that's a whole day discussion. But suffice to say, communities need to have band bylaws to at least give you the power to stop work orders. If you have a stop work orders, you stop payment, and then you don't have to pay them if the building's not being built properly. That is your enforcement power. You either do it correctly, where you issue a stop work order, or you don't get paid. That's the best enforcement you're going to get on any band bylaws enforcements. Next, please. So how do we draft bylaws for building and constructions? There are actually some really good examples out there. We'll talk about it a little later. But the purpose of focus of the bylaws is you have to say, what will it include? Will it focus on land development? Does it focus on land use, zoning? So do you have zoning bylaws? What are you going to name it in terms of land use and development bylaw? Are you going to call it bylaw number to provide the administration of building codes? Are you going to call it a bylaw for property standard bylaws or bylaw buildings? So you have to name that piece of bylaw that you plan to. And those are just some examples. I think West Bank and some of the Western communities, they're using land use and development bylaws, which includes building codes, also includes land zoning and commercial development as well, and one big piece of bylaw. It's important to determine the focus because existing bylaws can be used as a start, but based on our review, a lot of the existing bylaws are so old and out of date. It's a good start, but I think we can provide some better samples that would be a better starting point. Next, please. So the structure of the bylaws, they need a title. You need to have definitions. So for example, what is the chief building official? What building code are you going to use? Are you using the National Building Code, or is the application of the provincial building codes within that jurisdiction? So you need to define which code you're using. Is it the National Energy Guide, or is it going to be a provincial, or is it electrical guide? So you need to define what rules are going to be enforced in those communities. Again, in BC, a lot of the First Nations that have passed bylaws, they say, thou shalt follow the BC building codes, thou shalt follow the BC codes. So they make it clear. Where the communities, they say, we will follow the national building code. So you need to figure out what code you're following. And why is that important? We get calls, again, from contractors and from industry suppliers for construction products. They're saying, what building code do they use in that community? And then you have to explain all this stuff, and it gets really convoluted for them because, you know, it's not cut and dry, right? So then you need general provisions. What do you want to accomplish? So, for example, if you're going to do zoning, then you have to have, you know, residential, commercial, industrial, rural. If you're going to issue a building permit, what is that building permit? Is it, you have to have a copy of the application? Is it, it needs pre-approval? Are you going to require site plans? Are you going to require a building permit or a building blueprint that is signed by an architect or by an engineer? Again, if you take that process that happens in municipalities, one of the best examples, take that process and adopt it to your communities and just make any minor changes. You also need an enforcement and administration component. So for example, what is going to be the cost? Is there a cost for building permits? Is it based on the total value of the house that's being built, or is it a nominal fee? And does the building permit also include renovations, sheds, decks? Are you also going to have one for if you're knocking down buildings? So that permits, you have to figure out how far you want to reach into the community. The enforcement administration, just back up there again, sorry, quote, the enforcement administration, and again, clearly articulate the stop work orders or any fines or penalties. And if there's a stop work order, then you say stop work order means no payments, no advance payments. It just stands still, right? You have to have an appeal system in place. So if a chief building official issues a stop work order, there's dispute, how are you going to resolve that dispute? Generally, in a lot of First Nations, it will go to chief and council. My suggestion is you move it to a third-party review, you hire another architect, or you move it to arbitration. You don't want to bring in chief and council to start meddling into construction activities, right? You want to keep them away from this stuff. So, and then you issue a schedule, which is all the application forms and cost and all the, paperwork, the bureaucracy to move the permit system forward. Next, please. So, as I mentioned, definitions are extremely important. So, who is the chief building official in the First Nations? And if there is no chief building official, is it the band administrator who is the chief building official? So again, for some of the communities that are small, you don't have a chief building official or inspectors. So perhaps the chief building official will become the band administrator. So he has responsibility for construction projects. So other words that need to be defined, as I mentioned, National Building Code. Are you adopting provincial, electrical, plumbing? Who are the inspectors or building officers? Are you hired under contract? So if you are using inspectors from a tribal council, then the bylaw should say we will be using inspectors from tribal council X. So it's very clear of who has that responsibility. What type of inspection reports? And you should have a schedule of what is that report? Is it the report of a standard that's used in the province, or is it an ISC, or is it CMHC? You have to have a printing of your stop work order notice. What does this thing look like? So all these terms need to be clearly defined and articulated in the bylaw. Next, please. So, general provisions. This includes the most significant general rules and specific provisions within bylaws. So again, it's the duties and responsibilities of the building inspector. So you go into more detail. Who is going to do the enforcement? For example, I guess the question is, I ask, what are the rules for keeping building permits or documents within the community? So some should keep them up to 10 years. Are they digitalized? Are they just paperwork? Do they go in the file? Again, from a risk perspective, is it only in a filing cabinet in the band office? And if there's a fire, do you lose all those? Or is there duplication where those files go off the community? So again, you need to figure out how you're going to manage the paperwork. Generally, from a risk mitigation point, you may want to put everything onto a cloud, make sure it's moved off in a couple of different areas with very secure passwords. Issue stop work orders. How did that happen? What were the sites? Who follows up? Issue of occupancy permits. Very few communities issue an occupancy permit, right? So I know there's a dire need. You've got to get the family in quickly. But if there's no final permit to say this house is clear of all infractions or all building code activities have been completed, you can now move in. Very few communities have occupancy permits because they're moving in, and we have pictures of people moving in and kitchen cabinets haven't been installed. And 5 years later, they still haven't been installed. And then the next one is who conducts inspections. So there has to be a clear rule. The other thing that should be illustrated in the band bylaw on building is the power of the building inspectors. When can they enter the building? Do they have to give 24-hour notice? Do they give any type of notice going forward? How do you remove or unauthorized encroaches on lands or parcels? So for example, if somebody is building a home that doesn't, for example, meet the zoning, well, how do you deal with that issue? So I've been in some communities where they stop an infrastructure project because somebody received their certificate of possession, they built a home, and when the home was built, they moved it closer to the front line, to the road, and they moved it there because they didn't want to look through another person's window to see their window on the other side. So they moved it, and that stopped actually infrastructure. They couldn't put in the waters and sewer, but they hooked up the hydro. So I said to the community, because you never dealt with that, one way that you can deal with it is not provide the electrical power hookups. So again, I'm just going through some of the powers of inspectors. You know, for example, required test, who does the test, soil conditions, radon gas for new construction. So again, these are all part and parcel that has to be built into the bylaws for building. Next, please. So enforcement, as I mentioned, we always do moral suasion, but there are other ways you can enforce compliance. So we talked about stop work orders. You can post a notice on the construction site saying that, you know, this is the stop order's been made because it violates these parts of the building codes. You can give verbal and written warnings. You can make decisions on actions, but best of all, how best to get enforcement, you hold back payments. You do not do any advance payments. And I understand the challenges of ISK money coming in, you got to get the payments out. But at the end of the day, if the home is not being built to the building code, then you should not be issuing payments. And again, I've been dealing with a community in British Columbia where they provided advances to the house and they paid basically 100% on the house on 80% completion, with the contractor promising to come back. And now I think it's like 3 years later and they're still waiting for the contractor to come back. They can't even move into the house, and now the house has been empty for a few years and now it's being vandalized. So the chief and council has to go back and borrow more money to offset that cost, right? So, okay, enforcement appeals. If someone doesn't like the decision, how would it get resolved? I talked about you build in some conflict resolution, dispute resolution mechanisms. Maybe, you know, have an inspector from another community come in to look at it, see what's happening. Again, we can provide those services through or identify some of the resources to help address some of these appeals. So go ahead. The schedule, as I mentioned, all your bureaucracy, all copies of applications, what's the price of these applications, all your guidelines, all your policies, the processes, the application, the addresses, the name of the person who's received the administration, which band office building it goes to, all this stuff goes into the schedule. So, okay, next. So current bylaw situations, as I mentioned, we think there's probably about maybe 12 communities that have bylaws up to date. Some communities have bylaws, but they're very out of date. And a lot of it's not even applicable. It's so out of date. The size of the community should have no relationship to the details you may require for your bylaws. So you say, well, we don't need a really detailed bylaw because we only have 3 homes. That, you know, you don't want to work with that. The more the details, the better. So, you know, if, for example, one of the larger communities has a 15-page bylaw, then if it's good for the large communities, it should be adopted for the smaller communities. You do not want to circumvent and cut out a bylaw just because, well, we don't need the detail. You need the detail. Major gaps to ensure home constructions, new and renovations are meeting building codes. So not only are we talking about new construction, it's also very important to talk about renovations. This is one of the major gaps in many communities. We talk about new, but nobody's talking about renovations, which are equally important to ensure that they meet building code, fire code, especially where we know the situations where heat sources are being installed after homes are built. And we know through coroner's inquest and fires in some of these homes that heat sources were installed, were not inspected, and that was the major cause of the fire deaths in many of the communities. So renovation inspections are extremely critical. Next, please. So that's the recap on the authority having jurisdiction. we have sample bylaws that we can share. If you reach out to us, we can share them. I know West Bank has a good one. To West One has good bylaws. Like there's some really good examples out there. We have other examples that are actually those communities that function under the Indian Act as well. So we have a number of very good examples. My suggestion would be is to take these. We have some where you just fill in the blanks and move forward with them. Okay, why is it important? Because if you don't have ban bylaws, it's hard to build the next structure of building permits, stop work orders, and we're into this building bad, right? And how do we stop building bad? Well, communities need to take on their governance responsibilities, introduce bylaws, and that's the first major step to build better. Okay, comments, questions, discussions? Dale, I have a question for you. What bylaws do you guys use for building?
Well, I'm fairly new here at Catesy, so I'm just sorting through. I don't believe there is a building bylaw, but there is a land law that requires adherence to BC Building Code.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you just changed jobs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we'll talk further.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so so with that bylaw, so at least the rules are set, you gotta follow the BC code, so at least it's clear what jurisdiction is occurring in the community, so. First big step.
John, Claude here. I don't see any other questions right at the moment. Maybe just a brief reminder about our next upcoming one with the building inspector and inspection issue. Certainly kind of should be an interesting panel.
Yes, yes, so what we're looking at, hopefully to accomplish there is, one of the discussions that we have is what do building inspectors really do in First Nations, and how do they carry out their roles and responsibilities, knowing that there are limited bylaws, knowing that they don't have a lot of powers, but they continue to do their goodness, right? Going out doing inspections and making sure compliance and moving this inspection machine without having really a strong governance apparatus. So we're going to have a discussion of how they seem to manage that. And then we have one later in the fall where we have First Nation building officers in discussions with municipal building officials. And we talk about comparison between on and off, and where we have off reserve, where you have, legal structures, legislative, constitutional, yada, yada, yada. But what's interesting is the challenges that municipal building officials off reserve have are very similar to the challenges that on reserve inspectors have. And so we hope to highlight some of those discussions.
Yeah, John, I think that should be a real interesting comparison. You touched on the stop work order issue, and to me, having done a fair amount of work in the sector outside of certainly First Nation communities, the power of that stop work order is amazing. I was involved with a few projects where the municipality, or in fact, in one case, the city, basically put a stop work order on one of our projects. It's a very, very powerful tool. And if you break, we'll say you try and sneak the guys back in to do the work, there's fines. And certainly there's, the issue of, you touched on the enforcement. So, I mean, if you want to, play games with the city municipality when it comes to stop work orders, or we'll call it directives, they've got the enforcement and tools behind them. but certainly I do see it as being a challenge to some of the certainly smaller First Nation communities.
Well, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm fine, but actually Candace just posted a question. Has there been any consideration made for liability and risk exposure to First Nation how enacts that I guess enacts a bylaw? Has a CBO, in the instance of a faulty building practice that had been either missed or overlooked by the CBO, insurance, etc.? I know, John, we know that there are examples, good examples that are basically case law now, off reserve, where municipalities have been held responsibility. Years ago, there was the old saying, you can't sue City Hall. Well, I think the courts have proved that sort of comment sort of erroneous, that you can sue City Hall for their error or neglect. But John?
But if we relate that to Candace's question, can you sue chief and council? And that's a fantastic question, because while the courts have deemed municipalities who are the authority having jurisdiction in a number of court cases, which we highlighted earlier, has that happened with First Nations? And I know that under fiscal responsibility, chiefs and councils who have the authority having jurisdiction from a fiscal management point of view have been sued by their band councils, by the members for their failure. So I know there's already cases relating to fiscal management, relating directly to building. I know anecdotally, we know of examples where people who move from off reserve back home because they lived off, they're moving back, and they have the money and they build their own home. And so they go to chief and councils and they say, we're building our own home. What do we do? Chief and council says, fill your boots up. It's your house. Do what you want. So they build a home. They hire a contractor. And I assume he's building to code. But we know the specific example where after several years, the foundation gave way and the owner of the home contacted the insurance company, and the insurance company said, send us your building permits, send us your inspection reports, send us all of those plans, and let us look at it to see what we can do. The owner said, well, I don't have that. Insurance says, well, good luck. You should sue somebody else. They actually end up suing chief and council, and they quietly made the repair. It costs around, I think around $50,000, $60,000 to have to lift the house up, redo the foundation. Now, what I find interesting in that case is, where does the chief and council have $50,000, $60,000 to lift up somebody's house? So I just assume it had to come from another funding source, maybe education or health or something to fix that. So, and I do know in cases where fire deaths are occurring that lawyers are now suing chief and councils for fire-related deaths in the homes because they're not to code. So there's anecdotally, we believe it's happening, but I believe it's just a matter of any time. And because traditionally, members don't sue their chief and councils, but I think that's changing. That's just my general views of seeing what's happening. I could be wrong, but the more recent case on fiscal responsibility, I think, highlights the role and responsibility for chief and council to have authority jurisdiction to make sure the communities is safe, homes are built to codes, and people can live in a very safe manner. Go ahead, Candace.
Hey, John. So I guess the question I have then is like the opportunity for insurance. I mean, as a CBO, you're going to want to make sure that you have some type of liability insurance to cover yourself, to make sure that the First Nation also has insurance when they're enacting a bylaw, and then implementing this process. Is that correct?
Yeah, so, again, good question. So we know, so when a chief and council purchases insurance, if they're an employee of the council, they have what's called errors in the mission insurance and inspection insurance. So they're a member of the band, and bands, councils would have the insurance for construction. We've been discussing, and we have a webinar in January where we're trying to encourage communities to actually purchase construction insurance. This is over and above of insurance to make sure, for example, if there's a fire on that, it's a separate coverage. So we're trying to encourage communities to do that. Independently, if you're an independent, you would have that errors and omission insurance, and that ranges. So a fellow like a Jim Monroe, who is independent, he would be paying, I don't know, 3 to 4 or 5,000 a year. And again, somebody like Jim has all these certifications, so he's part of association, so he's able to keep his cost under control through his memberships. But yes.
Thank you.
So on a final note, on the authority having jurisdiction, one thing that we've been trying to encourage is, while we know tribal councils work with a number of their members, we are trying to work with councils to actually become that authority having jurisdiction. So if they have several members under their jurisdiction, and maybe, these member communities may build 1 or 2 homes, to turn that over to the whole planning, building inspections, solely over to the council, and let them take that on. Work with the community in terms of maybe drawing, but it's just easier for that to happen. Well, I know councils are in that position to provide it. Many of the members continue to try to build their own. And we know in those situations, it becomes a challenge. And again, we were talking to one tribal council who's been trying to move in this direction. And a couple of band members or members of the tribal councils opt to do their own. And they said they've had 4 or 5 projects that have gone totally off the rails for cost, expenses, overruns, and homes aren't built. And so, and again, why? They said because the person doing the project management doesn't have the capacity or the knowledge, and then council got in the middle of it. So it's just a god-awful situation, as they described it. So you try to avoid those situations, because the banks don't really care per se. You borrow for 300,000 and you hope to have a $300,000 home at the end of the day. On reserve, that doesn't become an issue. So off reserve, if I'm going to build a home and I borrow 400,000, I have to demonstrate to the bank I have a $400,000 home. And if it's less, they want to know, okay, why is it less? And if it's more, they want to know why it's more if you're coming back. So banks, through their own process, keep control off reserve, but that doesn't happen on reserve. Go ahead, Candace. I saw another click there.
Oh yes, sorry. I just had another question in terms of the authority and the way my mind is working right now. Do you see the as I'm working through this, do you see more of an advantage to have this authority step back, hands free from the existing administrative process in the community?
In a perfect world, that'd be the best. So you get a group, for example, like a FNNBOA, right, who is an independent group, becomes the sole probably organization for doing plan reviews and sign-offs. So we work with the communities. They say we want to build these homes. We work with them to build to do the procurement. We look at the plans. We work with them to make sure the construction process. But yes, it just makes it easy because you separate the community from the contractor. but you depoliticize the building process, which
Okay.
seems to become, and it doesn't matter even off reserve, the politicalization of construction is, it gets costly.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay.
John, I think that just about wraps it up, unless there's any last minute question.
Okay, I'm good. If not, then we move to, again, my apologies. I had a doctor change on a time and I've been waiting for this appointment. I figured, oh geez, I got to, and I know Claude tried to reach me a few times, but as I experienced one of Candace's day, I spent 2 days on Zoom calls. My throat was dead and I couldn't even return any calls. Like, I just can't believe how much time you spend in front of the screen. And people say, well, you can do other things. No, no, you can't. You can't. Outside of maybe drinking coffee, that's it. So, so again, my apologize. But on so what do we have on Monday, Claude, for next one? Is it
Well, we are going to talk to the building inspection side, and really,
Right.
what do those inspectors really do?
That's
Are,
right.
you mentioned coffee. Are they all sitting at maybe like I would be doing at Timmy's, having a coffee?
Exactly. That's
Uh,
it. There's
hey, I've got a lot of municipal inspector friends, and I seem to see a lot of them hanging out in there. I hope
excellent.
that's not the case.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. And if you're interested, so before we go, in the Indigenous Building Knowledge Exchange, if your community wants to take advantage of that, please reach out to me directly or info@FNNBOA. And the radon gas, equally important, please reach out. And like I said, I have funds, it's all free services. So I have funds that I basically need to spend within the fiscal year, and it's a bit of a pilot. So I'm putting our years of understanding on hold. And yes, I will send that to Candace to send out to her colleagues through the association. So anyway, thanks everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye
Bye.
now.